In a small corner of the city, where cobblestone streets shimmered under neon lights, and the sound of traffic blended with the rhythm of bustling life, Aisha walked with outward confidence, but harbored a rigid belief inside. As a Black American woman, she grew up in a community where love was not merely an emotion, but an unwritten set of rules. To Aisha, love had to be simple, predictable, and above all, confined within the boundaries of race. Not because she hated people of other skin colors, she constantly reminded herself of that, but because that was how the world in her view was arranged. Everyone should stay in their lane, she often thought, as if it were an unquestionable truth. In 2025, society has changed significantly compared to a few decades ago. Debates about racial equality still raged online and in real life. Social media posts overflowed with opposing opinions from X to other platforms, one side calling for removing all barriers, the other clinging to outdated prejudices. In Aisha's city, diversity was evident. Restaurants served cuisine from every continent. Music from all over the world echoed through bars, and interracial couples were no longer rare. But for Aisha, that diversity was only surface deep. Deep in her mind, she maintained an invisible wall, built from family stories, adult teachings, and the judgmental glances she had witnessed as a child. Aisha grew up in a neighborhood where Black people lived close together and bonded like one large family. Her mother, a strong but conservative woman, often said, "You have to choose someone right for you, someone who understands you, who understands our culture." Those words weren't just advice. They felt like a command. Her quiet but strict father agreed. "Don't complicate things, Aisha. Life is hard enough already." These lessons etched themselves into her mind, becoming a compass for every decision, especially in love. For Aisha, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was about harmony with her community and tradition, and what she had been taught was right. But life, as an unchanging law, rarely follows the rules humans set. On a cold February evening, Valentine's Day to be exact, when the city was awash in shades of pink and whisperings of love, Aisha entered a familiar coffee shop, where she often met her best friend, Maya. The air outside was chilly, her breath turning into little white clouds under the streetlights. Couples passed by hand in hand, their radiant smiles only highlighting the loneliness Aisha tried hard to conceal. She hadn't come here to find love. She didn't believe she needed it right now, but to enjoy a peaceful evening with Maya, the friend who always brought laughter and spirited debates. However, in this very place, in the warm ambiance of the cafe, fate had prepared a challenge for Aisha. She didn't know that a man would step into her life within a few hours, not to change her through lectures or confrontation, but simply by existing, by being himself. Ethan, a white American man, would become the breeze that passed through the wall of prejudice Aisha had built for years. He would make her question everything she once believed to be unshakable, forcing her to look inward and confront the truth that sometimes the deepest beliefs are also the most significant mistakes. Aisha's story did not begin with a romantic moment or a dramatic turning point, but with a small sense of unease, like a pebble rolling down a mountainside, triggering an avalanche. That Valentine's night, as she sat at the familiar table, glancing at the couples around her with a curious and distant gaze, she could never have imagined that everything she believed in would collapse. The wall of prejudice, seemingly solid, would be shattered by simple moments, by chance encounters, and above all, by the kindness of someone she once thought didn't belong in her world. Aisha pushed open this glass door of the cafe, a familiar place she and Maya had turned into a regular meeting spot for the past 3 years. Inside the space was warm, filled with soft yellow light from the wall-mounted lamps. Gentle jazz music floated through the air, blending with the murmurs of couples scattered around small wooden tables. Valentine's Day had transformed this cafe into an oasis of love, where people exchanged passionate glances and meaningful handholds. But to Aisha, the atmosphere only made her feel out of place, as if she were standing outside a world she had no intention of entering. She found Maya at their usual table by the window, where light from the street streamed in, casting sparkling streaks across the table's surface. With her high-tied curly hair and ever-ready smile, Maya was scrolling through her phone, her fingers moving swiftly, as if debating with the entire world on X. Aisha sat down, set her purse aside, and ordered a latte. "You're late," Maya said, without looking up, her voice teasing. Aisha shrugged. "Traffic. It's Valentine's," she replied, though in her heart she thought Valentine's is just an excuse for people to make a fuss. Aisha picked up the latte that had just arrived, stirred it gently, and let her gaze wander around the cafe. The couples made her uneasy, not because they were in love, but because some seemed to disregard the rules she had always believed in. Near the counter, a black woman was beaming at a white man, their hands entwined, as if no barrier existed between them. Aisha frowned, turned to Maya, and whispered, "Look at that. That black girl with that white guy. Why, though? They're not right for each other." Her voice carried a trace of resentment, as if she were stating an undeniable truth. Maya stopped scrolling and looked up with a stunned expression. "What did you just say?" she asked, her tone low but sharp. Aisha shrugged, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "I just said it's strange. People should be with their kind." "Don't you think?" Maya set her phone down, eyes narrowing. "Aisha, it's 2025. Do you still think like that? You sound like some old conservative aunt from the last century." Aisha felt her face flush with heat. "I'm not prejudiced," she replied quickly, her voice slightly louder than intended. "Things would be simpler if people didn't mix things up. It's natural." Maya sighed and shook her head. "Natural? Are you talking about love or sorting groceries? Do you even hear yourself? You say you're not prejudiced, but the way you looked at that couple, the way you said mix things up, it's no different from bias." Aisha opened her mouth to protest, but Maya's words hit her like an invisible punch. She felt attacked, yet deep down, a quiet voice whispered that maybe Maya wasn't entirely wrong. She pushed the thought away, gripping her latte as if it were her only anchor. Their conversation was interrupted when the cafe door swung open, bringing a gust of cold air from outside. Aisha glanced up instinctively, and that's when she saw him. A white man, Ethan, stepped in with a confident yet unassuming demeanor. He was tall, wearing a fitted dark blue coat, and his blue eyes swept across the room as if searching for something. The space around him seemed to adjust automatically. Several curious glances turned his way, but he smiled lightly and walked straight to the counter. Aisha muttered just loud enough for Maya to hear another one. The word "one" carried a tone of annoyance, as if Ethan's presence was an intrusion. Maya glanced at her, frowning. "Stop that, Aisha. Seriously, you're making me embarrassed." Aisha smirked, pretending not to care, but her eyes remained fixed on Ethan. He stood at the counter, speaking briefly with the barista, his warm, deep voice cutting through the room. "Black coffee. No sugar, thanks," he said, and the barista responded with a bright smile. "As always." Ethan. Ethan. Aisha remembered that name, even though she didn't want to. She turned away, took a sip of her latte, and tried to refocus on Maya, but Ethan's presence in the corner of the room was like a small stone in her shoe. Not painful, but irritating enough to be felt. As Ethan walked past their table to pick up his coffee, he accidentally made eye contact with Aisha. "Sorry, am I bothering you?" he asked politely with a light smile. Aisha froze for a moment, then replied curtly, "No." She turned her face away, but not in time to hide the coldness in her eyes. Ethan nodded, said nothing more, and walked off with his coffee. Maya looked at Aisha, shaking her head. What was that? He just asked a question. Aisha shrugged, but her heart was beating faster than usual. She didn't like this feeling, a mix of unease and irritation stirred by Ethan's gaze. She told herself that he didn't belong in her space or world. But deep down, another feeling, vague and hard to define, began to creep in. It wasn't hatred. It was insecurity, as if Ethan simply by existing was challenging the wall of prejudice she had spent years building. The atmosphere in the cafe remained warm, but Aisha felt a chill run down her spine as Ethan walked past her and Maya's table. The latte in her hand suddenly felt heavy, as if it anchored the tangled thoughts in her mind. With a naturally unsettling presence, Ethan held his black coffee and found a small corner seat near the counter. He pulled out a thin book, flipped through a few pages, and looked out the window, his eyes calm, as if the entire world belonged to him. Aisha tried not to look, but her gaze drifted toward him, pulled by some invisible force. "You okay?" Maya asked, her tone laced with teasing, when she noticed Aisha losing focus. Aisha, startled, set her latte down and shook her head. "I'm fine. Forget it." She didn't want to admit that Ethan's presence was throwing her off. Not because he had done anything wrong, he hadn't even acknowledged her after her curt response earlier, but because he represented something she didn't want to face. A white man, confident, polite, and seemingly unbound by the rules she had lived by her entire life. Maya raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "You keep looking at him." "What's going on?" Aisha frowned, her tone slightly sharp. "I'm not looking. I'm just thinking." Maya chuckled, shaking her head. "Thinking what? He shouldn't be here because he's not like us." "Aisha, you need to let go of that mindset. Seriously." Maya's words were like a needle piercing Aisha's pride. She wanted to argue, to say she wasn't a bad person, that she was protecting what she had been taught. But instead, she stayed silent, sipping her latte to hide her discomfort. In the corner of the room, Ethan seemed oblivious to their conversation. He sat there reading, occasionally sipping his coffee, a gentle smile appearing when the barista walked by and said something teasing. Aisha realized he was a regular here. The barista called him by name, her voice friendly, as if they had known each other for a long time. "Ethan, no laptop today?" she asked. Ethan smiled and replied, "No, I just wanted to relax today. Work's been overwhelming." His voice was deep and warm, and he carried a sincerity that made Aisha listen without meaning. She turned to Maya, trying to change the subject. "What are you reading on X? Still arguing with someone?" Maya shrugged, scrolling through her phone again. "Just some posts about equality. Some people still think like you, Aisha, that everyone should stay in their place. But the world is changing, and I'm glad it is." Maya's words once again touched an old wound. Aisha felt cornered. She wanted to say she wasn't like those people and didn't hate anyone, but she knew Maya wouldn't readily accept her reasoning. Suddenly, a moment interrupted Aisha's thoughts. Ethan stood up, walking toward the counter to grab a napkin. A small pen fell from his shirt pocket as he passed by Aisha and Maya's table. It rolled across the floor and stopped near Aisha's feet. She looked at the pen, then at Ethan, who turned back to find it. "Oh, sorry," he said, bending down to pick it up. For a brief moment their eyes met. Ethan's blue eyes held no hostility, only politeness and a hint of curiosity. "Thanks for not kicking it away," he joked, flashing a smile that caught Aisha off guard. She didn't reply. She only gave a stiff nod, but her heart beat faster. Ethan returned to his seat, leaving Aisha with discomfort and confusion. "You see," Maya whispered meaningfully, "he didn't do anything but be kind. And you're acting like he's the enemy." Aisha shot Maya a look, but said nothing. She didn't want to admit that Ethan's smile voice and how he paid no mind to her coldness started shaking her. She told herself that firmly, not because she liked him, but because he didn't fit the image she had built of people like him. The conversation between Aisha and Maya continued, but Aisha's mind was no longer present. She thought of her mother, of all the times she had warned her about preserving identity. She thought of her father, who always said life would be easier if she didn't make things complicated. But Ethan seemed to challenge every rule she had ever known with his unbothered and straightforward presence. He wasn't doing anything to stand out, wasn't trying to prove anything, but that very calmness made Aisha uneasy, as if he were silently asking a question she didn't want to answer. Why did you build this wall? When Aisha and Maya left the cafe, the sky had darkened. Streetlights reflected off the rain-soaked pavement after a light shower. Aisha pulled her coat tighter, trying to shake off the cold and the whirlwind of thoughts in her head. Maya walked beside her, chatting about an interesting post on X, but Aisha only nodded absent-mindedly. She couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, his smile, and the strange feeling she couldn't name. It wasn't attraction she insisted on, that it was a disturbance, as if a piece of her perfectly arranged puzzle had shifted. She didn't know that just a few days later, she would run into Ethan again, not in the cafe, but in more unexpected places: the gym, the supermarket, the library. And each time, he would unknowingly shake her wall of prejudice, not with words or grand gestures, but simply by existing, by being himself. And Aisha, despite all her resistance, would soon realize that the wall wasn't as solid as she once thought. In the days following the evening at the cafe, Aisha tried to push Ethan out of her mind. She told herself he was just a passerby, a fleeting moment not worth dwelling on. But life, as if playing tricks on her, had other plans. Ethan began appearing in places she least expected, like a melody that replayed, no matter how hard she tried to turn it off. Each time they met, he unknowingly shook the wall of prejudice she had built, not with words or grand gestures, but with a presence that was simple, kind, and impossible to ignore. The first time was at the gym on a Saturday morning. Aisha, dressed in tight-fitting workout clothes, was running on the treadmill, with hip-hop music blaring in her ears. She focused on breathing, trying to clear her head off the argument with Maya and Ethan's unforgettable gaze. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar figure enter the weightlifting area. Ethan was adjusting the weights in a gray t-shirt and shorts with quiet concentration. He didn't look her way, but Aisha's heart began to race. She told herself, "It's just a coincidence. This city's small after all." She increased the treadmill speed, as if running faster would help her escape his presence. But Ethan turned and caught her looking, as if sensing her gaze. He smiled, not a forced or performative smile, but a friendly nod, as if they'd known each other for years. Aisha froze and turned her face away, pretending to focus on the treadmill screen. She hated this feeling, a mix of discomfort and confusion, as if Ethan were trespassing into her personal space. But deep down, she couldn't deny that something about his smile made her want to look again. She shook her head, scolding herself, "Don't be stupid, Aisha." The second encounter happened at the supermarket one late afternoon. Aisha was browsing the coffee aisle, searching for her favorite roast. She had just finished a long day at work, was in a bad mood, and wanted to get home. But as she reached for the last bag of coffee, another hand touched it simultaneously. She turned, and there was Ethan with a half-apologetic smile. "Oh, sorry," he said, pulling his hand back. "Go ahead. I'd never fight a true coffee lover." His voice was gentle, tinged with humor, as if trying to ease the invisible tension between them. Aisha clutched the coffee bag tightly and replied curtly, "Thanks." She wanted to walk away immediately, but Ethan's gaze held her momentarily. He didn't seem bothered by her coldness. He just nodded and grabbed another bag from the next shelf. "Do you come here often?" he asked, his tone casual, like speaking to someone familiar. Aisha frowned, not wanting to continue the conversation. Sometimes she replied, then turned and walked off, leaving Ethan with the same smile still on his lips. She stepped out of the supermarket, coffee bag in hand, but her mind was in turmoil. Why is Ethan so kind? Why doesn't he react when I don't want to talk? She thought of her mother, of all the times she had warned her that outsiders could never understand her or belong to her world. But Ethan, with how he gave up the coffee and smiled even when she was cold, seemed to challenge those teachings. She felt a new unease, not because she disliked him, but because she couldn't fit him into the box she had prepared in her mind. The third encounter was at the public library, where Aisha often went to find some peace. She sat in a corner, flipping through pages of a book on cultural history, but her mind wasn't really on it. She was still thinking about Ethan, about how he kept appearing like an uninvited shadow. And then, as if fate were toying with her, she saw him walk in, carrying a small stack of books. He sat a few tables away and began taking notes with focused attention. Aisha tried not to look, but her eyes kept drifting his way, watching how he pushed up his glasses while reading and how he smiled when he found something interesting. Suddenly, a librarian approached Ethan's table and asked quietly, "Did you find the book you needed?" Ethan nodded, then said loud enough for Aisha to hear, "Thanks. I'm researching the multicultural history of this city. It's fascinating to see how people from everywhere came together to build this place, despite all the hardships." His words made Aisha freeze. She thought about her community and the stories her mother told her about Black people's struggles. But Ethan, a white man, was researching those things, not with arrogance, curiosity, and respect. She felt a quiet shock, as if a piece of her prejudiced worldview had just been shaken. She stood up and left the library earlier than planned, her heart heavy. These encounters could no longer be dismissed as coincidences. They felt like constant reminders, forcing her to see Ethan not just as a white man, but as a person with thoughts, emotions, and his own story. She recalled Maya's words. "You're afraid to admit you might be wrong, right?" That sentence now echoed louder than ever. Aisha stepped onto the street, the city lights sparkling around her, but inside her was a storm of contradictions. She didn't want to admit that Ethan was affecting her, that the wall of prejudice she had built was beginning to crack. The chance encounters with Ethan had become unavoidable in Aisha's life, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself they were merely coincidences. Every time she saw him at the gym, the supermarket, or the library, she felt a troubling disturbance, as if he were unintentionally digging up corners of her mind she had kept buried. She wanted to keep her distance and wall of prejudice intact. But Ethan, with his natural kindness and non-judgmental gaze, was making her question beliefs she once thought unshakable. On Wednesday afternoon, Aisha stepped into the public library, where she often escaped the city's hectic pace. The quiet space, with its scent of old books and the soft rustle of turning pages, always gave her a sense of safety. She picked a secluded corner near the history shelves and opened a book about the civil rights movement she was researching for a personal project. But her mind wasn't truly there. She kept thinking about Ethan, his smile at the supermarket, the way he spoke about multicultural history during their last encounter. Those moments, though small, clung to her like puzzle pieces that wouldn't quite fit. She was turning a page when she heard soft footsteps. She looked up, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw Ethan walk in carrying a small bag and a few books. He didn't seem to notice her, or if he did, he didn't show it. He picked a table a few meters away, placed his books down, and began arranging his papers. Aisha looked down, pretending to read, but her eyes drifted toward him. She noticed he was writing something, his hand moving quickly across a notebook, occasionally stopping to search on his phone. His concentration intrigued her, though she didn't want to admit it. Suddenly, A librarian, an older woman with a gentle smile, approached Ethan's table. "Still digging into the city's history, Ethan?" she asked warmly. Ethan looked up and smiled. "Yes, Miss Mary. I'm trying to learn about the first immigrant communities here, seeing how much they went through to build a life." His voice was deep and full of respect, as if he wasn't just reading the stories, but feeling them. Aisha, seated behind the bookshelf, sat motionless. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Ethan's words held her in place. The librarian nodded, then asked, "What made you so interested in these stories? Not everyone takes the time to research like this." Ethan paused. His writing leaned back in his chair and looked out the window as if remembering something. "I grew up in a diverse neighborhood." He began, his voice slow. "There were all kinds of people, black, white, Asian, Latino. But it wasn't always easy. I saw friends get hurt by prejudice and dismissed just because they looked different. One of my closest friends, Jamal, was denied an opportunity just because of his skin color. It made me angry, but it also made me want to understand more. I wanted to know why we keep building these walls and how we can tear them down." Ethan's words swept through Aisha's mind like a cold wind. She gripped her book, her fingers trembling slightly. Jamal. A name, a story, and suddenly, Ethan was no longer just a white man in her eyes. He had friends' experiences and invisible scars from witnessing injustice. She thought about her mother and their family's stories of discrimination. She had always believed that only black people could understand that pain, that outsiders like Ethan couldn't possibly feel it. But his words and the sincerity in his tone shook that belief. Miss Mary nodded and smiled. "You're a special kind of person, Ethan. Not everyone cares like you do." Ethan smiled softly and shook his head. "I'm not special. Nothing will ever change if we don't try to understand each other." He turned back to his notebook, but Aisha remained still, her heart pounding. She felt like she'd been caught doing something wrong, even though Ethan had no idea she was listening. She quietly gathered her books and left the library earlier than planned. Outside, the biting February air made her shiver, but the chill inside her was even sharper. She thought about Ethan, his story, and his friend Jamal. She thought about herself and how she had looked at Ethan with disdain simply because he didn't belong to her world. For the first time, she felt a trace of shame, not because she hated him, she didn't, but because she had judged him without knowing anything about him. She recalled Maya's words, "You're afraid to admit you might be wrong, right?" Those words now felt like a blade cutting deep into the wall of prejudice she once believed was impenetrable. Aisha walked down the sidewalk, city lights glittering around her, but her mind was elsewhere. She didn't want to admit that Ethan was changing her and that these chance encounters weren't just coincidences. They were like whispers from fate, forcing her to look inward, to confront the beliefs she had clung to for so many years. She didn't yet know that Ethan would continue to appear in the coming days, not to change her through force, but simply by living as himself. And her wall would crack a little more each time, until she could not keep it standing. In the days following that moment at the library, Aisha felt like she was walking a tightrope suspended between old beliefs and new questions. Ethan's story about his diverse neighborhood and his friend Jamal kept echoing in her head like a song she couldn't stop. She wanted to push it away, to return to the comfort of the rules she had lived by her entire life. But each time she thought of Ethan, a troubling unrest stirred within her. Not because she liked him, she firmly denied that, but because he was forcing her to confront a part of herself she didn't want to face. Aisha decided to meet Maya, hoping her best friend would help her make sense of the confusion. They arranged to meet at a small park near downtown, where old oak trees cast their shadows over the gravel paths. It was a chilly February morning. but pale sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating shimmering patches of light on the ground. Maya had arrived early, sitting on a wooden bench holding a cup of hot tea, her eyes drifting over the joggers and children playing nearby. When Aisha arrived, Maya smiled, but there was a hint of caution in her smile, as if bracing for a difficult conversation. Aisha sat down, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice hesitant. Maya raised an eyebrow and took a sip of her tea. "You okay? You look like you just ran a mental marathon." Aisha laughed, but the smile quickly faded. She took a deep breath and began. I keep running into that guy, Ethan, at the gym, the supermarket, and the library. It's like fate is messing with me." She paused, looking at Maya, waiting for a reaction. Maya set down her tea, her gaze sharp. "And does that bother you? Because he's white?" Maya's words were blunt and direct, and caught Aisha off guard. She wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't that, but she knew Maya would see through any excuse. "I don't know," Aisha admitted, her voice low. "I just feel confused." "He's kind, Maya. Really. I heard him talk about growing up in a diverse neighborhood and about a friend who faced discrimination. I didn't think someone like him would care about those things." Maya tilted her head, her expression softening slightly. "So why are you confused?" "Because he doesn't fit the mold you created for people like him." "Aisha, you're afraid to admit you might be wrong, right?" Maya's words hit their mark. Aisha felt her face flush with heat. She stood up suddenly, her voice louder than she intended. "I'm not wrong. I was taught that things are supposed to be a certain way." "Maya, don't you get that? My family and my community survive because of these rules. I don't hate anyone, but I don't want to complicate things." Maya didn't flinch. She looked Aisha straight in the eyes, her voice calm but firm. "Rules? Aisha, those aren't rules. That's prejudice. You think keeping people in their boxes makes life easier, but don't you see? You're the one making yourself miserable. Ethan hasn't done anything but be kind to you, and you keep pushing him away just because he's not like you. Do you think that's loyalty to your community? No, that's trapping yourself in the past." Maya's words struck Aisha like a punch to the chest. She wanted to argue, shout that Maya didn't understand, and that she wasn't bad. But no words came. She thought of her mother, and all the times she'd said that outsiders could never understand them. She thought of her father, who always stressed that she had to preserve her identity. But then she thought of Ethan, his sincere eyes as he spoke about his friend Jamal, how he gave her the last coffee bag at the supermarket without the slightest irritation. These images swirled together, forming a storm in her mind. Aisha sat down again, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know what to think anymore, Maya. I feel like I'm betraying myself just by thinking he's not awful." Maya sighed and placed a hand on Aisha's shoulder. "You're not betraying anyone. You're just learning to see the world differently. And that's not easy." "I know. But Aisha, if you never question what your family taught you, how will you ever know it was right?" The conversation ended in silence. Aisha watched the children playing in the distance, her heart heavy. Maya stood up and gently patted her shoulder. "I'll always be here. But you have to find the answer yourself. Don't let fear stop you from seeing something good." Maya walked away, leaving Aisha alone with her swirling thoughts on the bench. She felt lonelier than ever, not because Maya had left, but because she realized she was standing at a crossroads. One path was familiar, where she could keep her wall of prejudice intact. The other was new, where she would have to face the truth that she might have been wrong. She stood up and walked down the gravel path, the sunlight warming her shoulders, but not the chill inside her. She didn't know Ethan would appear again in the coming days, not to force her to change, but to remind her that kindness knows no boundaries. And each time she would face the question, Maya had left hanging in the air. Are you brave enough to admit you're wrong? The argument with Maya at the park left Aisha with an uncomfortable emptiness, as if she had lost a part of herself. Maya's words that she was imprisoning herself in prejudice kept echoing in her head, intertwined with images of Ethan, his kind smile, and his story about his friend who faced discrimination. She tried to return to her routine, going to work, reading, seeing friends, but every quiet moment gave her thoughts the chance to rise again. She didn't want to admit she might have been wrong, but the unease inside her grew like a crack in the wall of prejudice she once thought was impenetrable. On a Friday night, Aisha left the office later than usual. Work had piled up, and she had stayed behind to finish a critical report. The sky was pitch black when she exited the building, and the February air cut through her thin coat. She walked toward the nearby bus stop where the flickering light of an old street lamp cast strange shadows on the pavement. She checked her phone. The next bus would arrive in 15 minutes. She sighed, her breath turning into white mist, and pulled her scarf up to cover her chin. The bus stop was deserted, with only the distant sound of traffic and the wind rustling through dry branches. Aisha stood alone, hands buried deep in her coat pockets, trying not to think about the cold or the loneliness creeping in. But then she heard footsteps, slow, heavy, accompanied by low laughter and murmured words. She turned, her heart pounding, as she saw 3 men emerge from the corner of the street. They wore hoodies and moved staggeringly, as if leaving a bar. Their eyes locked onto her, and Aisha felt a wave of fear crawl up her spine. "Hey girl, standing out here all alone," one of them said, his voice slurred mockingly. Aisha gripped her phone tightly, pretending not to hear, eyes fixed on the pavement. She hoped they would leave, but their laughter only grew louder. "What's wrong? Not friendly?" "Want to talk?" another said, stepping closer. Aisha stepped back, her shoulder hitting the lamppost. She opened her mouth to say something, to tell them to leave or scream, but her throat tightened. The street was empty and the bus still hadn't arrived. Just as the nearest man reached out as if to touch her, another voice rang out, calm but commanding, cutting through the darkness like a blade. "She doesn't want to talk. Leave her alone." Aisha looked up, heart racing. Ethan was standing there a few meters away, hands in his coat pockets, his gaze sharp but not aggressive. He wasn't taller or stronger than the other men, but his presence carried a strange power, not threatening, but utterly confident. The group turned around, one of them scoffing. "Who the hell are you? Some hero?" Ethan didn't flinch. He replied in an even tone. "Just someone who can see she doesn't want to be bothered. Leave." Before this turns into something worse. Something in his speech, not a threat, but certainty, made them hesitate. They muttered something under their breath, then walked off, their laughter fading into the night. Aisha stood there, her hands still shaking, her breath uneven. Ethan turned to her, his gaze softening. "You okay?" he asked, his voice deep and sincere. Aisha nodded, but words wouldn't come out. She wasn't just trembling from fear, but from another feeling deeper and sharper. Shame. The man standing in front of her, the one who had protected her without hesitation, was the very man she had looked at with disdain, had pushed away simply because he didn't belong to her world. She thought of all the times she'd been cold to him, how she had boxed him into a category labeled white man. But here, in this moment of danger, he was the only one there. Thank you," she finally whispered, her voice so soft it nearly vanished in the wind. Ethan gave a faint smile and shook his head. "It's nothing. Take care, okay?" He turned and walked into the darkness, leaving Aisha standing there, heart pounding wildly. She watched him go, his figure fading under the dim streetlight, and for the first time she didn't see him through the lens of race. She just saw a man, a good man, who stood up for her without needing a reason. The bus finally arrived, its headlights casting light onto the sidewalk. Aisha stepped on and sat near the window, her eyes blank as she looked outside. She thought of Maya and her warning that Aisha was locking herself inside her prejudice. She thought of Ethan, how he didn't boast or demand gratitude. And she thought of herself and the beliefs she had clung to for years. For the first time, they no longer felt certain. The wall of prejudice that had once felt as solid as the stone was now full of cracks, and she didn't know if she dared to let it fall. The moment at the bus stop had changed everything. When Aisha returned to her small apartment, closed the door behind her, and sank into her worn-out armchair, she felt like she had crossed an invisible threshold. The traffic echoed faintly through the window, but it was just white noise, unable to drown out the thoughts screaming in her head. The image of Ethan standing under the flickering streetlight, his calm yet firm voice as he confronted the men, played over and over in her mind, like a scene on a loop. And with it came the sharp sting of shame, cutting deep into the beliefs she had held onto for years. She turned on her desk lamp, the warm yellow light casting a soft glow over the family photos on the wall. Her mother with a stern but warm smile. Her father with eyes that always carried a hint of caution. They had taught her that the world was full of danger, and that she had to protect herself by holding tightly to her identity. "Don't let outsiders shake your foundation," her mother used to say. And Aisha had lived by those words, building a wall of prejudice to feel safe. But tonight, the person who stood up for her wasn't someone from her world. Not her mother, not her father, not even Maya. It was Ethan, the man she had looked at with contempt, the one she had pushed away, simply because he was different. Aisha stood and walked to the window, looking down at the busy street below. The city in 2025 was a colorful tapestry, a place where people from everywhere blended. But she had chosen to live in a small corner of it, where everything followed her rules. She thought of Maya and their argument in the park when Maya called her beliefs prejudice. At the time, she was angry and felt attacked. But now, sitting alone in the stillness of her apartment, she couldn't deny that Maya had a point. Ethan had done nothing but show kindness, and yet she had judged him, put him into a box because of the color of his skin. And when she needed help the most, he was the one who was there without hesitation. She picked up her phone and scrolled through a few saved posts on X. One article spoke about the city's diversity and how people were working to break racial barriers. Another told the story of a black woman learning to accept love from someone of a different race. Aisha had once scrolled past such stories, skeptically thinking they were idealized tales. But now they felt like mirrors reflecting her back to herself. She thought of Ethan's story of Jamal being discriminated against, of how Ethan spoke about tearing down walls. She realized that while she had been building walls to protect herself, Ethan had chosen to open himself up to understand others. She walked to her desk and picked up a small notebook she often used for notes. She wrote, "Why am I so afraid to admit I was wrong?" The question made her pause. She thought about her family, her community, and the many times her mother had spoken about the discrimination they'd faced. Those stories had shaped her, but they had also instilled fear. The fear that if she opened her heart, she would lose a piece of herself. However, Ethan showed her that opening up wasn't about losing, but discovering something bigger through his quiet presence and selfless actions. She continued writing. "I was wrong to judge him. But how do I fix it?" That question weighed even heavier. She didn't know what to do, whether an apology would be enough, or whether she dared to face Ethan. She thought about his expression at the bus stop, free of resentment, filled only with genuine concern. She thought of Maya, of her advice that only Aisha could find the answer for herself. And she thought about her identity, The girl who once believed love and life had to follow clear boundaries. That girl stood at a crossroads, unsure if she was ready to move forward. She closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and lay in bed. The late-night silence was broken only by the clock ticking on the wall. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, she saw herself facing another version of herself, a version of Aisha, who wasn't afraid of change, who wasn't scared to admit she was wrong, who wasn't afraid to see Ethan as a person rather than a white man. She didn't know if she could become that person. But for the first time, she wanted to try. She wanted to believe that her wall of prejudice wasn't permanent, that she could choose another path. The path Maya had spoken of. The path Ethan seemed already to walk. As dawn peeked through the curtains, Aisha sat up feeling a new fragile sense of clarity. She knew she needed to see Ethan, not just to thank him, but to begin making things right. She didn't know where that conversation would lead, but was ready to face it. To face him. To face Maya. And most of all, to face herself. After a long night of soul-searching, Aisha woke up with a new sense of determination. Fragile, perhaps like the first rays of sunlight piercing through the curtains, but real. She knew she needed to meet Ethan, to thank him for helping her at the bus stop and confront her mistakes. An apology, she understood, was no simple act. It required her to shed her defenses and admit she had been wrong to judge him solely because of the color of his skin. She reached out to Ethan through a mutual acquaintance at the cafe, asking if he could meet that morning. When he replied, "Of course." 10 o'clock. Her heart beat faster with a mixture of nerves and hope. The cafe where everything had begun now held a different meaning. When Aisha stepped inside, the soft jazz music and warm yellow light from the hanging lamps welcomed her. But the space no longer felt like the place where she once viewed the world through a lens of prejudice. She chose the familiar table near the window, where she and Maya had once argued about Ethan. She ordered a latte, but didn't stir it. She held it tightly, trying to calm the trembling in her hands. She checked her watch. 5 minutes to go. She inhaled deeply, murmuring the words she had practiced all night. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I want to change." Ethan arrived on time, carrying a calm presence that unsettled and impressed her. He wore a light blue shirt with rolled sleeves and his usual gentle smile. "Hi," he said, sitting across from her. "Are you okay? After what happened at the bus stop?" Aisha nodded, managing a faint smile. "Yeah, I'm okay. Thanks to you." She paused, her throat suddenly dry. Ethan didn't rush her. He nodded and ordered a black coffee, waiting for her to continue. She took a deep breath, looked him in the eyes, then dropped her gaze to her latte. "Ethan, I want to apologize," she began, her voice hesitant. "I mistreated you. I looked at you through the wrong lens. Because you're white, I assumed you couldn't understand me, that you didn't belong in my world. But I was wrong. What you did at the bus stop, how you were kind even when I was cold. I realized I judged you without ever knowing you." The words spilled out awkward but sincere, and Aisha felt like a weight had been lifted from her chest. Ethan listened, his eyes never leaving hers, his expression free of judgment. He set his coffee down when she finished and offered a gentle smile. "Thank you for saying that, Aisha. Really. But you know, hate is a habit. It's easy because it doesn't require us to think. But choosing love, choosing to understand someone, that's harder. And it's worth it." He paused, his eyes glinting softly. "I had biases too, unlike yours, but I get it. An old friend of mine, Jamal, helped me see that we don't have to be the same to care about each other." Aisha blinked, surprised by his honesty. She remembered the story he'd told at the library about Jamal and the diverse neighborhood he grew up in. "You talked about Jamal at the library," she said quietly. I overheard. You care about that kind of thing, don't you?" Ethan nodded, smiling slightly. "I grew up with friends from everywhere. I saw them get hurt and didn't want to be part of that. I try to live in a way that doesn't add to the walls people already build." Ethan's words felt like a cool breeze easing the tension inside her. She realized he wasn't just forgiving her. He was opening a door for them to understand one another honestly. She smiled for the first time without restraint. "I don't know how to make it rightfully, but I want to try. I want to learn how to see people the way you do." Ethan shrugged, teasing gently. "There's no formula. Just start with a cup of coffee and a conversation. Like this." They both laughed and the air between them lightened. They began talking about other things. Books, music, their favorite restaurants in the city. Aisha realized Ethan wasn't just the man who had protected her. He was funny, curious, and easy to be around. She told him about her civil rights history project, and Ethan listened intently, offering thoughtful suggestions. For the first time, she wasn't seeing him through the lens of race. She was seeing Ethan, someone sitting across from her sharing a moment. As they left the cafe, the February sun lit up the sidewalk with a gentle warmth. Ethan turned to her, smiling. "Thanks for today, Aisha. If you ever want to talk again, message me." Aisha nodded, feeling a kind of relief she hadn't known before. "I will," she said, and this time she meant it. She walked down the street, her heart filled with a new feeling. She was no longer the Aisha of a few days ago, the one who built walls to protect herself. She was learning how to take them down brick by brick. And Ethan, with his quiet, unwavering kindness, was helping her do it. She knew this journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt she was headed in the right direction. The meeting with Ethan at the cafe relieved Aisha as if she had stepped through a door she once believed was locked. Her apology, though awkward, had been met with understanding, and their conversation had opened a new path, a path where she could see him not through the lens of race, but as a potential friend. Yet inside Aisha, there was still one missing piece. Maya, the best friend who had boldly confronted her prejudice, who had walked away from the park with a look of disappointment. Aisha knew she needed to repair that relationship, to restore their friendship, and prove that she was truly changing. She texted Maya on a Saturday morning, asking to meet at a small diner in their old neighborhood where they used to share laughter-filled breakfasts. "I need to talk. Please come," she wrote. When Maya replied, "All right, 11 a.m., Aisha felt hope and nervousness. The diner with its red brick walls and the faint smell of pancakes was familiar, but today it held a different meaning. Aisha arrived early, choosing a table by the window, where the February sunlight spilled across the scratched wooden surface. She ordered a hot tea and gripped the cup tightly to calm her nerves. Maya walked in her curly hair tied up as usual, but her eyes were guarded, as if bracing for another difficult conversation. "Hey," Maya said, sitting down and ordering a coffee. "You okay? You look different." Aisha gave a faint smile and nodded. "I'm okay. I want to talk about the other day, at the park." Maya raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt, waiting for Aisha to go on. Aisha took a deep breath, meeting Maya's gaze briefly before looking down at her tea. "I'm sorry, Maya. I was wrong to get angry at you. You were right. I let my prejudice guide me. I clung to what I was taught without asking if it was right. I was afraid of change, afraid that if I let go of those rules, I'd lose a part of myself. But I'm trying. Really. I met with Ethan. I apologized. And I realized, you were right. The world is bigger than I thought." Maya listened, her expression gradually softening. She took a sip of her coffee, then tilted her head, her voice gentler now. I'm not mad at you, Aisha. I was just disappointed because I know you're better than that. I grew up with you and saw how strong and trapped you were in ideas your family put in your head. When I talked about prejudice, I wasn't trying to attack you. I just wanted you to see that you could be more. She paused and smiled slightly. And hearing you talk about Ethan, wow, I didn't think you'd go that far. Aisha laughed, the tension melting away. Neither did I. But he made me rethink everything. He stood up for me at the bus stop when I was in trouble. I stood there ashamed, forever thinking he wasn't worth caring about just because he's white. I don't want to live like that anymore, Maya. I want to learn how to open my heart. She paused, her eyes sincere. And I need you. You've always been honest with me, and I'm grateful for that. Maya set down her coffee cup, her eyes shining. You know, Aisha, I've always been here for you. But I also need you to be honest with yourself. Change isn't easy, and there will be moments when you'll doubt it. But if you've started, don't stop. She reached out and took Aisha's hand. I'm proud of you. I mean it. Aisha felt her eyes sting. She squeezed Maya's hand, smiling. Thank you. I won't promise to be perfect, but I'll try. They continued chatting, and the tension of the past dissolved. Maya told her about a recent article on X about how communities in the city were organizing events to promote diversity. Aisha shared her conversation with Ethan about how he spoke about breaking down walls. They laughed and ordered more pancakes. And for the first time in weeks, Aisha felt like she had found herself again. Not the girl trapped in prejudice, but the Aisha who was learning to live with her heart. The February sun warmed their shoulders with a gentle glow when they left the diner. Maya hugged Aisha and whispered, "Keep going, girl. I'll always be rooting for you." Aisha nodded, feeling a newfound certainty. She knew her journey of change was far from over, but with Maya beside her and Ethan as a new friend, she no longer felt alone. She walked down the street, her heart light, ready for whatever lay ahead, whatever it may be. After reconciling with Maya, Aisha felt like a weight had been lifted. Their conversation at the diner restored their friendship and strengthened her resolve to keep changing. She began to see the world with fresh eyes, no longer clouded by old prejudices. But more than anything, she realized that Ethan, the man who had accidentally entered her life and shaken the foundations of her guarded heart, was becoming an essential part of this journey. She didn't dare call it love, but she couldn't deny that he made her feel something more profound than friendship. Aisha and Ethan began meeting more often, not because of chance encounters anymore, but because they chose to. One afternoon, they met at an old bookstore in the city center, where dusty wooden shelves and the scent of aged paper created a cozy haven. Aisha wandered through the history section looking for a book on the civil rights movement she wanted to revisit. Ethan stood beside her, teasingly holding a science fiction novel. "You're always so serious. Try this. It'll launch you into outer space." Aisha laughed and shook her head. "I like staying on Earth, thank you, but I'll consider it if you read my book first." They kept talking, shifting from books to music to childhood memories. Aisha spoke of evenings listening to jazz with her father, of how he taught her to find joy in even the saddest melodies. Ethan shared stories of sneaking off with friends to watch street bands, laughing as he recalled when his mom caught him and gave him an earful. Despite their different backgrounds, these small stories brought them closer. Aisha realized that though they came from separate worlds, they shared something deeply human, a love of music, a curiosity about life, and a desire to be authentic. Another evening they walked along the riverside, where city lights shimmered on the water like scattered stars. February's chill still hung, but Aisha no longer felt the cold. She and Ethan spoke about their dreams. Ethan shared his plan to open a community space where people of all cultures could gather and share their stories. "I want to create a place with no walls," he said, eyes glowing. Aisha looked at him filled with admiration and emotion. You believe that's possible, don't you? Ethan smiled and shrugged. If I didn't, how could I ever start? She told him about her research project and her dream of writing a book about the history of the Black community in the city. Ethan listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and offered ideas she hadn't considered. She realized he didn't just care, he respected her story. He didn't try to impose his view. At that moment, standing by the river as the wind gently lifted her hair, Aisha looked at Ethan and felt a connection she couldn't quite name. He was no longer the white guy she had once judged. He was Ethan, the man who made her laugh, challenged her thinking, and made her heart beat a little faster. They stopped at a small riverside cafe and ordered 2 mugs of hot cocoa to warm up. As they sat across from each other, the soft candlelight on their table lit up Ethan's face, and Aisha said, "You know, I used to think I couldn't change, that what I'd been taught was forever. But you and Maya, you've shown me that I can." Ethan smiled, his gaze warm. "You changed yourself, Aisha. I just happened to be there." She shook her head, smiling softly. "No, you did more than that. You showed me that love, or whatever this is, doesn't need boundaries." Her words lingered in the space between them, and for a moment, Aisha felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the words had come honest and unretractable. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, his smile growing. "You're right," he finally said, his voice low. "No boundaries, just 2 people willing to understand each other." They fell silent, but the moment wasn't heavy. It was warm, full of promise, like the candlelight dancing between them. It was late when they left the cafe, but Aisha didn't want the evening to end. They walked a little farther, talking about silly things, favorite movies, the worst foods they'd ever tried. And when they finally said goodnight, Ethan looked at her and said, "See you again soon, Aisha." She nodded, smiling. "Definitely." As she walked home, her heart felt light, as if she were floating. She didn't know if this was love yet, but for the first time, she was ready to find out if fate would allow it. Aisha's journey, from the day she was imprisoned by prejudice to the moment she opened her heart to the world, was like a river winding its way to the sea, full of twists and turns, but ultimately reaching something vast. Her encounters with Ethan, her arguments with Maya, and the long nights of self-reflection had transformed her, not through grand upheavals, but small, meaningful choices. She was no longer the woman who looked at interracial couples with discomfort, who had pushed Ethan away simply because he didn't belong to her world. She was Aisha, a woman learning to love by following rules and listening to her heart. On a late February afternoon, Aisha stood outside a small community center on the city's outskirts, where Ethan was hosting a pilot event for his project, a space for people from different cultures to share their stories. The old building, with its patchy brick walls and large windows, had been decorated with colorful fabrics and paper lanterns. Inside, laughter and lively conversation filled the air, mingling with the scent of freshly baked cookies and coffee. Aisha, dressed in a simple blue dress, stood at the door, slightly hesitant. She wasn't there to support Ethan, but to confront a part of herself, one still anxious about stepping into a space full of strangers. Ethan saw her from afar, his smile radiant. He walked over with a cup of coffee, his eyes gleaming. "You came. I was afraid you might change your mind." Aisha laughed and shook her head. "I promised, didn't I? Besides, I'm curious to see what your space with no walls looks like." Ethan led her inside and introduced her to a Mexican musician, a Black teacher, and a Korean couple. Each person carried a story, and Aisha listened, feeling her heart expand. She realized that these stories, though different, shared one common thread: the desire to be seen and accepted. Maya was helping arrange the food table in one corner of the room. Her eyes lit up when she saw Aisha. Girl, you look radiant, Maya said, pulling her into a tight hug. Aisha smiled, feeling the warmth of friendship. Thank you for always being there, Maya. I couldn't have done this without you. Maya winked. Don't forget Ethan. That guy deserves some credit too. Aisha blushed, glancing at Ethan, who was chatting about street music with a group of kids. She couldn't deny that he had become an essential part of her life, not just as a friend, but perhaps something more profound. When the event began, Ethan stepped onto a small platform, microphone in hand. Thank you all for coming, he said, his voice calm and steady. Today isn't about me. It's about all of us. Everyone here has a story. When we share them, we break down the walls between us. I believe that one story at a time we can build a better world. Aisha looked at him, feeling a mix of pride and emotion. She thought of her journey, how she had once built walls to protect herself, and how Ethan, Maya, and even she had helped tear them down. Then, unexpectedly, Aisha was invited to speak. She hesitated, but Ethan's encouraging gaze and Maya's nod gave her the courage to step forward. I used to think the world needed boundaries. She began, slightly trembling. I grew up believing that love, friendship, everything had to follow the rules. But I was wrong. I've learned that when we open our hearts and choose to see the person in front of us, we discover a much bigger world. I'm here today because someone showed me that. She glanced at Ethan, smiling, and he nodded warmly in return. The event ended with applause and hugs. Aisha stood outside, watching people slowly leave, her heart full of peace. Ethan joined her, hands in his pockets, eyes gentle. You were amazing, Aisha. Your story. It touched everyone. She shook her head and smiled lightly. I just told the truth. And I learned from you, from Maya, from everyone here. They stood under the falling sunset, and Aisha felt a connection that needed no words. Aisha's story didn't end in perfection, because change is a journey that never truly ends. But she knew that with each step, she was moving closer to a better version of herself. She had chosen love, understanding, and believing that one heart at a time, the world could change. As she and Ethan walked together under the streetlights, talking about the days ahead, she knew that no matter what the future held, she had found the most important thing, the freedom to live true to herself.